So why don't we get started, because we have a lot to cover today. So thank you to everyone for joining us for this webinar. It's the second in a series of 5 webinars that we're putting on as part of Cooperative Month. Before we get going, just to quickly thank our sponsors. There's a lot of work behind the scenes to put this together, and we appreciate all the support that we've received with a great group here. My law firm, Bernstein, Shur, here in Portland, Maine, Cooperative Maine Business Alliance, Columinate, Cooperative Development Institute, and the Cooperative Fund of the Northeast. And thank you to everyone and people who helped us put this together. As I mentioned, we have a series of 5 webinars. Last week was the first webinar. If you weren't able to join, I hope you'll be able to watch the replay online, and I hope you'll be able to join us for other ones in the future. Today, you can go to the next slide. And one more. Today, we're going to be focusing on Cooperative 101 and startup issues for cooperatives. And we have a great group of experts joining us today. First, my name is Adam Prescott. I'm a shareholder at Bernstein, Shur, a law firm in Portland, Maine. And my primary practice is in the area of business restructuring and insolvency, although a growing cooperative practice, which has been great over the last few months. Also joining us today as panelists, we have Chris Linder, Loan and Outreach Officer from Cooperative Fund of the Northeast, Greg Brodsky, the founder and co-director of Start.coop. We have my colleague here at Bernstein, Shur, Helen Coburn. Helen's an attorney in our business law practice group, where she works with startups and investors in a wide variety of corporate securities laws and other issues. Then also joining us as a special guest, we have Sarah Spear, who Sarah is going to give us is going to provide us with some background about her own story as a founder of a co-op that's in the middle of the launch phase. And so we look forward to hearing from Sarah as well. Go to the next slide. As I mentioned, we have a lot to cover today. So we're going to start at a high level. We know people are joining us with all different levels of exposure to cooperatives. And so we're going to provide some introductory remarks on what a cooperative is. Then we're going to turn to Sarah and hear a little bit more about her experience running a cooperative startup. We're going to then turn back to some more specific comments on the co-op startup timeframe and the process. And then we're going to turn in a little more detail to startup financing. And then hopefully we're going to leave some time at the end for questions and answers. The Q&A feature should be available for everyone. So please feel free to write questions as we go, and we'll do our best to address them either as we're going through the slides or we'll leave some time at the end to get to them. So with the sort of introduction out of the way, why don't we jump right in onto the next slide. And why don't we start with you, Greg? Let's start very, very high level. Can you just explain to everyone on here what is a cooperative and what are some of the common types of cooperatives that you see?
Well, yeah, good morning. And first of all, thank you for Adam and Bernstein Shur for putting this webinar on, and to my fellow panelists. And I see some familiar names in the audience. So it's great to be here, and thank you guys for just having this space. Cooperative is one of these funny words that everyone's heard, but most people can't accurately define. 76% of people would rather buy from a cooperative, but 89% of people can't define what it actually means. The way that we explain it is it's a business owned by its members. And maybe the easiest way to explain it is in contrast to a regular investor-owned company, right? We're all familiar with the idea that investors maybe own the majority of the business, and the people supporting the business are over here on the other side, not getting most of the benefit or most of the say. And with a co-op, all we're trying to do is bring the Venn diagram together and say, what if the people who support the business actually own it, right? And at its core, it's that simple. What makes it a little more complicated is that co-ops can exist at any level of the supply chain. So you can have a consumer co-op like REI or a consumer food co-op. You can have a worker co-op like Equal Exchange or 2D Tempeh or a number of other worker-owned companies around the US. You can have a small business co-op. So Ace Hardware is a co-op of 4,000 small businesses across the US working together under a common brand. And then if you go up to the top level of the supply chain of farmers, you can even have a farmer-owned co-op. So companies like Ocean Spray cranberry juice or Blue Diamond almonds or Organic Valley are all farmer owned. But I think what they all have in common is they give voting rights and controls to their members, and they give economic rights to their members.
Great. Thanks, Greg. And Chris, you work with a lot of cooperatives at CFNE on the lending side, although I think it's a little broader than just the lender capacity. From your perspective, what do you see as really the benefits of forming a cooperative compared to some of the traditional businesses like Greg was discussing?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is often I mention that cooperatives are what you would call the original B Corp companies that you've seen forming in the last 5 years. In its core, a cooperative is a values-based organization, and if you look at the 7 basic principles of a cooperative, it really speaks to how employees are treated, how consumer owners are treated, and how the overall community is treated. And those 7 principles, just quickly, are open and voluntary membership, democratic member control, particularly if you are an owner, you get 1 share, 1 vote. Doesn't matter how much money you put in. Members' economic participation. So we're talking about worker-owned co-ops today. Each owner would benefit both from being an employee, but also in potential dividends if those are available. Autonomy and independence. While you can have outside investors, those investors cannot take control of your business. Education and training of the workers and consumers are a big part for just both learning about cooperatives, but also in advancing in your career. And then the last 2 are around cooperatives are should cooperate with themselves, with each other, not necessarily always compete, friendly competition, and then concern for community, which often comes along with environmental values and everything else. So those are the core principles. The other thing I would say is just cooperative by definition means more than 1 person. A lot of startups do start with 1 person. So the advantage is, our rule of thumb, but it's not hard and fast, is you need at least 3 unrelated parties. To really have a cooperative form. And what that does is it helps you have a brain trust to really get things started, but also to share the work. So yeah, I'll stop there, Adam.
Good. Thanks, Chris. And Greg, going back to you, I think some of the benefits and positives that Chris mentioned, I think probably also present some challenges, right, to co-ops. So as someone who's worked with a lot of startup co-ops, what are some of the common challenges you see, and maybe how does that relate to issues of ownership and control of the startup business?
Yeah, well, I think one of the challenges, just again, going back to perception, understanding what a cooperative business really is, right? It always seems like this mythical, magical thing, but really wrapping your head around the idea of, okay, who are the owners of our business and what does that mean for us, right? If we're not responsible investors, but responsible to our community, how does that change how we operate? But then to also go beyond that and still remember that you're still a business. So sometimes we meet founders who think, well, we're a co-op, that's our business model, right? And being a co-op doesn't magically create revenue or magically pay your employees. You still need to have an actual business model. And so when we talk to co-op founders, what we find is that they need 2 really different skill sets. They need to have sort of a governance skill set of, how do you bring people in? How do you get consensus? How do you help people make better decisions? But then they also need to have a business skill set. How do you actually run the day-to-day operations of what you're doing? And you need to do both. You need to say, yes, we're going to be inclusive, but we're also going to go out and run the business, and we're going to validate some of our theories. We meet a lot of startup founders that maybe have a grand vision in their head. We all have a grand vision in our head of how the vision is going to run, but to actually go out and test that with real consumers who have that problem, see whether they actually want that service, what are they willing to pay for it. I think that's one of the most common challenges that we see, is that people don't spend the time to actually go out and test their ideas. And then more specific to the co-op financing, I should mention that is always a challenge. any new business, and I know we'll talk more about this, but most new businesses need some amount of outside financing, but being a co-op has some special challenges around raising outside financing. It's harder to get outside investors, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and Greg, in terms of the economics of the cooperative, I think we could probably have an hour plus if just talking about patronage and tax implications and all that fun stuff. But at sort of a high level, can you walk us through just how the economics, the profit of the business, how that works in a cooperative, and maybe how it differs? And I know we'll talk a little bit more about it, but at least as an introduction.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in a traditional business, it's really just about the capital you put in, right? And we all know we're in an incredibly unequal economic environment, right? We live in an environment where 5 people have as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the population. So some people have money to put into a business, but the vast majority of us don't. But in a traditional company, depending on how much capital you put in, that's how much of the company you own, how much of the company you get a vote on, and if it's profitable, what percentage you get back. So if you put in, 51% of the money one time and you never touch the business again, you get back a lot of voting power and a lot of profits down the road. And that's how most of our economy is structured, right? In a co-op, it's about your ongoing participation, what we could call your human capital, not just your financial capital. So each year, how much are you contributing to the co-op? And that's what we consider your patronage. How much are you patronizing the co-op? Now, going back to the idea that there are many different forms of co-ops, in a worker co-op, what you're contributing might be hours. How much time did you put in? In a farmer co-op, it might be how many pounds of cheese did you sell in, or how many gallons of dairy did you sell into the co-op compared to other folks. In a consumer co-op like REI, it might be how much you bought, but you can participate in a lot of different ways. And so if at the end of the year, if there is a surplus profit and the board decides you don't have to reinvest for future things, whatever is distributed according to your percentage patronage. So it's not, some people think it's all evenly split. It's not. If you put in 10% of the patronage activity, you get back 10% of the surplus profit.
Thanks, Greg. Why don't we turn to the next slide? And Sarah, great to have you joining us today and to hear from someone who's actually gone through the process that we're talking about. So let me turn it over to you if you can tell us a little bit more about your business, some of the why you decided to form a co-op and some of the challenges you faced, and then obviously if others on here have questions as Sarah goes through, please feel free to jump in.
Great, thanks, and happy Co-op Month, everybody. So we formed in 2019, and we are in Biddeford, Maine, and we manufacture tempeh, which is a plant-based, soybean-based superfood. It's fermented, and it is locally sourced. We source from local farmers here in Maine. That's part of our values. And we are launching, we were supposed to launch a year ago, and we have had so many impacts from COVID. And also we've been in R&D because we are going to be the first tempeh manufacturer in the United States to ferment not in single-use plastic bags, which, believe it or not, is how tempeh is made. So to figure that out and have the manufacturers actually fabricate what you are specifying has been quite a road for us, a journey. But we're ready to launch in just a few weeks. So we're very excited about that. And we'll be available in lots of co-op consumer markets. And we'll also be in other small grocers. We have a distributor here, Crown of Maine, which also used to be a co-op and is now a B Corp. They would have a good story to tell about that in terms of challenges in financing. And what we did when we began, we knew we wanted to do a very different model. I had experienced getting venture capital for a previous food company and seeing the impact of large investors controlling a lot of the decisions and putting a lot of pressure on us and to exit and get to a certain size in order for the exit. So this time it was really not, we're a completely values-based company. And we knew that we wanted to be here providing value to our communities and to our entire state, the whole agricultural industry. So we want to be here for a long, long time. And that did not, jibe with traditional investing. We also wanted to be a national brand because we thought that our innovation of plastics free would be something that everyone would benefit from and also want. So our model is to franchise actually production co-ops across the country so that each one is sourcing locally, local beans and supporting local farmers. And so a consumer knows that wherever they buy our product, they're supporting local organic farmers in their communities. They're supporting their communities and workers. So that's our model. And we began with our values. And when we were thinking of co-ops, and when we put the 7 principles next to our own values that we spent days working on, it was like they were the same. And so we were just elated to be able to find a way forward that matched our values. But we didn't really know a whole lot about co-ops. So the first thing we did is a lot of research. And then we found the Cooperative Development Institute, contacted them, and we knew that we needed to set up our bylaws and get incorporated and all of those aspects that sort of codified our values and what a co-op is. And so we needed a co-op lawyer, and they put us in touch with one who's no longer practicing. And now we're with Adam and his company, Bernstein, Shur. And so that was a really great exercise. Again, we're completely driven by our values. And from there, we started really building the innovation and the whole path to more sustainable tempeh and more sustainable agriculture here in Maine and around the region. So we attended the Boston Fermentation Fair, which is where I met Greg Brodsky, who did a panel on co-ops and fermentation, which is just so perfect. And from there, we learned about Start.coop, and we applied and became part of their 2020 cohort. And I highly recommend for anyone who's developing a co-op that is scalable to look into that program. You get so much support, and it was such great timing for us. We were really at that moment in time where getting support around marketing and finance and doing your pitch and really learning the nuts and bolts of a co-op and how to analyze your market, everything. And the cohort itself of other co-ops and the alumni that you get to meet, it's an incredible, very rich, very meaningful program for a co-op. So that's really probably, I don't know how much more you want. I mean, there's a lot to, we're a worker owned, but we're a food production. And if there are any others in food production, there's a lot it's really just like a regular food production business, the rest of my business. And then there are a lot of parallels, like Chris and Greg were saying, just needing to have a business head and or support around you to help you, because that is key. But there are, and we'll get into it later, I'm sure, just unique resources like Start.coop, but also in terms of financing. And if you have a niche, like we have even a further niche to being a co-op, we're woman-owned, we're in the agriculture, sustainable agriculture. So you just keep drilling down and you find that there's support out there for you. And if you're a co-op, it's like a added benefit, I think.
Oh, great, Sarah. That was great. And I think we heard this last week as well. And I think Craig mentioned today that sometimes just awareness is the initial challenge here. And I'm glad you pointed out some of the other resources that are available. Let me ask, along the sort of development process, what would you say were maybe the biggest surprises you ran into? And in particular, are they sort of maybe legal challenges, investor challenges, operational challenges, or where did you run into the biggest surprises?
Well, COVID came 3 months after we started, so I mean, just having to maneuver that, and I mean, that's really was very, very difficult. I mean, the legal, I didn't mention that we also were able to get some pro bono legal services through the Conservation Law Foundation. They have, and that was specific to agricultural businesses, but in terms of our trademark, so we were able to do that through them. And so there are sometimes multiple levels of legal work that you need, and you really need someone to help guide you through that process. I mean, we just had sort of typical challenges that I don't think are unique to a co-op, and I don't think anyone necessarily, we tried oftentimes to play the co-op card to see if there's a more sympathetic, because we really are being values based, and I came from a nonprofit world before. You feel like there should be people that maybe care a little bit more about the things you care about your community and more sustainable world and equity and the way we treat each other. But that doesn't really matter when you're looking for a production space, and you would hope that it would. So just finding a production space has been a big challenge. We couldn't find anything in Portland. We found something in Biddeford, but it wasn't our first choice. That's an ongoing challenge for food producers, and there's a lot of infrastructure that's lacking in terms of relationships with farmers, food producers, and distributors. And trying to address that is something that is ongoing, and a lot of people are caring about that. And that was a big problem in the beginning as well. And I think that's it. And just knowing how to navigate, like getting inspections, and and we got a lot of support from Fork Food Lab, because we were there for a little while at the beginning, and they are very helpful if you're a food producer. I know that's all I know, so I'm happy to help people in that area. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Greg, before we turn to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about the co-op startup process and the timeline, a lot of which I think Sarah discussed. Question came in regarding a hybrid model where you have account for patronage as well as capital investment in your co-op. And I think that's something that we spent a fair amount of time sort of contemplating. So can you weigh in, Greg, on how that hybrid model might work and what you see out there?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe I just got to fill in a little bit of backstory here. So because co-ops are a little harder to finance, so I mean, at its core, right, it could be an organization owned 100% by its members. And so some co-ops don't have any outside investors, and they're looking for debt financing. And I just want to, and I'm sure Chris will talk more about this, but that's why co-op loan funds like Cooperative Fund in the Northeast and Shared Capital and a few others are so incredibly important, is they fill this missing gap to provide financing for co-ops. I know they provided critical financing to 2Ds Tempe and many others that we've met. But there are also, to the question, there are ways to bring in investors as well. So we're seeing a growing number of co-ops offering what are called preferred shares. So you can have the common stock owned by the members and then preferred stock owned by outside investors. And that preferred stock can be can pay a dividend, it can be allocation of profit, it can be paid back by a percentage of revenue. There's a few different mechanisms for it. But absolutely. So we're seeing more and more co-ops doing that. And there's always this sort of calculation of, how much preferred stock do we need to sell? How are we going to pay them back? And I think one of the big differences between a co-op and a regular company, to Sarah's point, is that most co-ops we meet are trying to create long-term ownership. They're not trying to exit within 10 years. So what that means is, for paying back investors, is most of the time when people put money into co-op, it needs to be self-liquidating, i.e., you're paying back investors out of actual company cash, revenue or profit. You're not waiting until the company sells. You're not waiting for some big exit to pay back investors. So the investment looks a little bit different. But there are absolutely ways to bring in investor shares and member shares, and we're seeing a growing number of people doing that.
Yeah, and I can just add to that. For us, we had so many different needs. So our capital for the equipment we needed was funded through the Cooperative Fund of the Northeast, and our R&D to develop this plastics-free fermentation method was paid for by Maine Technology Institute grants. And then the capital that we needed to stay running and develop our space and the rest and hire people, all of that came from the preferred shares that Greg referred to, that we were sort of developing almost live time, real time, with other co-ops, seeing what others are doing and modifying, sometimes based on what investors, reacted, how they reacted to it. And it's developing, it's exciting to see. And we have like 15 different equity investors. And they're in it for the long haul. They're in it because they're social impact investors and believe in what we're doing and want to do some good.
Great. Thanks, Sarah and Greg. And Helen, you work with a lot of startups and investors. What's your experience working with those startups compared to what Sarah's been talking about? And do you have any other resources that people may look to that might be helpful?
Yeah, and just to kind of focus on that very last comment that Sarah had in terms of the social impact investors, I think that's something that you're definitely seeing as a trend emerging in recent years. You're seeing large institutional investors having ESG mandates, so making kind of conscious investments in businesses that are operating based on articulated purposes. And that can be co-ops, and that can also be, you also see investment into like benefit corporations. And so that's just sort of a trend that we are starting to see in the investment community. I was, taking your question more broadly, Adam, in terms of some of the challenges or the story that Sarah presented. A lot of that, as Sarah noted, is not unique to a co-op. A lot of those issues are kind of common startup issues. And I think what Sarah has identified that's worked for her is utilizing the resources in your community. So, Sarah, you're here in Maine, so some of the examples that you gave, I think, are kind of local Maine resources, and those are great, and we have a whole list of those. But just to kind of take what you described and expand more broadly, I mean, you received help from an incubator. So Fork Food Labs is an incubator here in Portland that has a particular focus on food-oriented businesses. So for a co-op, depending on the industry that you're in, as you're kind of encountering some of these startup challenges, look at different incubators in your industry, or Start.coop, that one's obviously specific to co-ops, but think about incubators in your space that could be of aid. You can think about other local sort of business development, business support organizations, like SCORE is a national organization that helps a lot of early stage businesses, whether you're trying to start a scalable business or more of what we sometimes call lifestyle business in sort of the VC world. And so those are all resources that can help you really think through some of the business challenges that you will face. And I say challenge, but it's really just kind of part of the adventure. It's the different pieces that you have to put together. And there are a lot of resources out there when you're starting a new endeavor. And then one of the other things that Sarah mentioned that I think is common, whether you're starting a co-op or kind of a regular startup, and maybe perhaps slightly more intensive if you are starting a co-op, is the upfront legal needs. And so, you've got to form a legal entity. So with a co-op, that looks a little bit different than just like a regular corporation, not too much different. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit down the line, but but you need to find a lawyer who is familiar with that process, who can advise on considerations for your bylaws or your shareholders agreement, and getting your articles together. And then you've got, you want to protect the assets of the business. So that includes your intellectual property, like the trademarks that, Sarah mentioned, getting assistance from the Conservation Law Foundation with the trademark work. And so pulling all of those pieces together, in addition to just, asset protection with trademarks or IP, entity formation, you may also want to think about, template employee offer letters, employee handbook. There's a whole host of legal things that come at the outset for a business, and that's very common across all startups as well. Is that helpful response to your question, Adam?
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Helen. And I think you started to touch on some of what I think we're going to turn to next. So that's great. So why don't we go to the next slide? And Greg, we've touched on, I think, various pieces of this already in terms of the co-op, the timeline and the process. But from Start.coop and working with a lot of startups, can you just walk us through really the high level stages that the co-op goes through, and then we'll do a deeper dive into a few of these.
Yeah, this was Adam, you're kind of sending the questions in advance to the panelists, and this was actually the question I didn't have a clear answer to, because I've seen people do it in 6 months and I've seen people do it in 5 years, right? So some of it is, how complex is your idea, and how many people are working on it, and sort of how much time are you putting in. I think one of the real challenges that most people can't just leave their job and start a new thing, and you're trying to do it bit by bit and get something new going, which is always a problem. We do have a free online course we call Lean Co-op that I'll paste into the link if I'm allowed to, that walks people through this. But I think most people probably spend 6 to 12 months on the process if I had to pick an average. As Helen was saying, there's the incorporation side, and look, you could incorporate it in probably 48 hours if you had to. But then I think that the two places that people get slowed down a little bit is the creation of their bylaws. And we have if you go to start.coop/build, we have a bylaw starter kit people can look at, and we're working with Adam's team on some additional resources. But the bylaws really explain how your internal structure works. And then you need to spend a lot of time on the business planning. So how do you, how is this actually going to work, and really validating that with your stakeholders, and getting outside the building and talking to people. Getting the financing, as Sarah said, can take quite a while, and it just depends how long, how much money you need and how long you need it for. So that's probably the hardest thing to do, is anytime you have to go and ask people for money, it gets challenging, right? It gets very real, very fast. So, anyway, I don't know if that's the best answer I could give you, but there is a lot of in the weeds planning and execution that just takes some real time and effort, and you have to be really committed to it.
Thanks, Greg. And let me jump around a little bit too here. Chris, I think from the CF&E perspective, I imagine you're presented with a lot of business plans in various stages, sort of formal and informal. In terms of, at least what you're looking for and CF&E is looking for, when a potential co-op founder comes to you looking for financing, what do you look for in a business plan, and what do those look like when they're presented to you?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. We try to keep things pretty simple and flexible. So we have a one-page loan application. And the business plan really particularly for startups, and we try to be as inclusive as possible and not create work for people. So we do not encourage 50-page business plans and hiring a consultant to do it all for you. It's really about the process that you went through. So we really look at, we talk with the folks more about how they got to the business plan, and it's important to have a business plan, both for internal and external reasons, but we focus more on the process and how they work together to get there. Because they don't have some of the traditional needs as a startup, like collateral, like capital, we're really taking a look at how they work together as a team. So, we've taken grant applications, we've taken 3 to 5 page executive summaries. You're certainly welcome to do a full business plan, and often Helen mentioned SBDC. Mentors have often helped create financial plans. So, but the key things in a business plan are the key things in any business plan. It's the market, is the demand there, what is your financial plan? That's really important. And really where we're focusing on, since the traditional parts of lending, like I said, capital and collateral aren't there, we're really focusing on the team, and not just the expertise of the team, but again, it's about how they've been working together through that planning stage. And so those are the 3 primary components that we're looking at for, it's the market, it's the financial plan, is it going to work? You still have to make a profit, and who's on the team.
Thanks, Chris. And Helen, from the legal perspective, along the sort of time frame, when you're working with the startup, when do you see as sort of the right time to form a new legal entity? And can you maybe walk us through what's involved in that process and the timing decision?
Sure. So, I mean, I would say once you've got your idea and your concept, and in the co-op context, once you've got your other couple people who are going to be joining you in your new venture, and you're starting to have external conversations. So you need to start talking to someone in your supply chain. Maybe you're starting to talk about securing some financings. I think that, and even potentially beforehand, but like, to me, that's sort of the drop dead point. That's when you really want to start thinking about making sure that you've got a legal entity, because you're not engaging in those business negotiations and having those external conversations as you, an individual. You want to make sure that you're doing that on behalf of the company, and that things that you put together, assets that you develop, including like the trademark that we just talked about, those need to be owned by the newly formed company and not by an individual. So for example, for a trademark application, the applicant on that should be the legal entity and not Sarah Spear, for example. And I know that otherwise you end up creating complications down the road in terms of what assets are owned by the company. And if the right assets are not there, then they need to get assigned into the company or contributed. The other piece of this is if you're negotiating with third parties, if you're making commitments or incurring obligations or things like that, you don't want that to be you individually as a person. You want that to be the company and have the protection of the legal entity from personal liability that you could potentially face. And so, and this is common along any type of business entity formation. This wouldn't just be in the co-op context. It's, you want to preserve, you want to create this shield between you individually and the outside world, and where you may have exposure or not. In terms of actually putting that together, I think, as Greg noted, you can do so fairly quickly. So you have to file articles of incorporation for a co-op in Maine. You would do it in Maine, and it's a pretty standard form. You just have to get it completed and consistent with the law and submit the filing. And then you also have to put together bylaws and identify the initial members of the co-op, and that can all happen fairly quickly, with the caveat that when you start thinking about what you want in those bylaws, and you're kind of negotiating among members, like that's really kind of like the constitution of your company. So if you go into it knowing like, we are all in 100% agreement that this is how we want to run our company, that can go pretty quickly. If you have a lot of wood to chop, then it can take a little bit longer. But as a technical matter, in terms of getting the legal entity official in the state of Maine or whichever state you're forming, that can happen pretty quickly with a filing with the applicable Secretary of State.
Great. Thanks, Helen. And Greg, we've sort of talked about a cooperative, right? But the cooperative can take a couple different forms as a business, right? Can you walk us through what some of the options are, and maybe some of the factors that when you're working with startups, they might want to consider when deciding what type of entity they actually want to form?
Yeah, this is an important myth to bust. I think a lot of people think that to be a co-op, you have to be incorporated as a co-op at the state level. And most co-ops are not incorporated as a co-op at the state level, which I know sounds confusing. So just to back up a second, there's this notion of working cooperatively, right? It's sort of the spirit and ethos by which you're approaching the work and who else is on the team. And that's first and foremost. At the state level, we've seen LLCs, we've seen corporations, co-op tax attorney I know told me he's occasionally seen partnerships. And some states have co-op incorporation options and some don't. It's kind of a patchwork quilt across the US of who has it and who doesn't. But even in states with co-op incorporation options, sometimes people just go with the regular plain Jane corporation. So it seems like the majority of people choose a corporation, but some smaller worker co-ops choose LLCs. And I think those are the two most common ones. And then some people, if they like the state incorporation option, go with the co-op version of it. But you really don't have to be. And we just want to put that out there. You do not have to be incorporated as a co-op at the state level to be considered a co-op in most states. And then at the federal level, there's a co-op tax benefit, which can reduce double taxation. But again, that has almost nothing to do with how you're incorporated at the state level. So that's probably a lot of lingo. And I'm sure Adam and his team can help entrepreneurs navigate all that as it comes up for you, but hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I'll give you a cover grade that you are not a tax attorney and not attempting to be one, nor am I. So that's an entirely separate discussion. Why don't we go ahead to the next slide and see if we can stay on track. I think we're doing a pretty good job so far. In terms of the entity formation, I think Helen, you had talked about some of the common documents, articles of incorporation, bylaws. Greg, in terms of forming a cooperative, are there any additional cooperative specific documents you see?
Yeah, I probably let my prior answer bleed in here. I should have, anyway, so yeah, so I think it's helpful to think about, as Helen said, at the state level, you need to incorporate, and that's sort of, you're registering with the external state you're in. Internally, you have your bylaws. That's how you all are going to operate as a group. And then sometimes people will have a separate member agreement. Sometimes the member agreement is part of the bylaws. And we probably see like half and half there. And I've heard the arguments both ways, but basically the member agreement lays out, what is the member agreeing to with the co-op and vice versa? Like, how will that relationship look? And usually it references the bylaws. And then if you're going to have investors, there's a whole additional series of things that you really need to, that probably Chris and Helen should speak to, not to me, but that gets really complicated around securities and raising money. But those are the main documents you need to incorporate your bylaws, and then some form of member agreement.
And maybe Helen, just Greg brought up issues related to investors and raising funds. Can you talk to us about the securities laws issues that sort of overlay the capital discussion?
Sure. So I'll do a little bit of Securities Law 101. And it is interesting in the context of a co-op, and as Adam mentioned, our co-op practice here at Bernstein is fairly new. So myself and one of my securities partners who sits through the wall that way are getting into understanding some of these issues a little bit better. But I'm going to start just with global securities law 101, just so you understand what I'm talking about, and then we can talk in a little bit more detail about what that means when you're raising capital as a co-op. So generally, under federal and state securities laws, if you are offering or selling a security, and the definition of security is really broad, that sale of the security has to either be registered with the SEC and often an applicable state securities regulatory body, or exempt from registration, or your offering is illegal. So you obviously don't want to be in that last category. You're most likely not going to be in the first category, because when we talk about a registered offering, we're talking really about, in most cases, like in putting it in simple terms, an IPO, which is incredibly resource intensive. And as a brand new business, you're not going to be doing an IPO. So you're talking about an exemption from registration. And the reason that these laws exist is primarily, they were originally adopted in 1933 and 1934. So that was in the aftermath and in the midst of the Great Depression, with the idea of investor protection, making sure that people weren't basically getting put in a difficult position because there was wild speculation in the markets. So with that in mind, in terms of the types of exemptions that exist, one that's most frequently used with companies is one for essentially high net worth individuals. It's a private placement, and you generally have accredited investors who are high net worth individuals. With co-ops, this is where it's a bit interesting, because at the federal level, depending on how your co-op is structured, and that is a question that you have to look at, the initial issuance of equity to the members of the co-op is an exempt security. And so you've satisfied part of this exemption analysis. The challenge comes then again, this is making the assumption that from the way that you're structured, you meet that initial exemption. When you then raise additional capital, how you're doing it, whether the instrument that you're using to raise that capital is technically a security, which typically secured debt isn't, but if you're offering short-term promissory notes or convertible promissory notes or preferred equity, those things all count as securities. Then you have to go back through this analysis and figure out whether your equity that you would be offering is exempt under an applicable exemption. For co-ops, again, this can be interesting because there may be in some states exemptions for offering equity basically to existing security holders of the co-op, or even potentially a co-op member. But in the work that we have done so far, our recommendation is to kind of confirm with the applicable state regulator, if you're going to be raising capital, if you're going to be having your existing members invest in the business, kind of confirm with your state securities regulator to understand if they agree with the analysis that these folks meet the existing security holder exemption. I feel like I'm diving a little bit too much into the securities weeds here, so I'm going to take a big step backwards. But that's, there's all these rules federally and state regarding how you can offer securities, whether to your existing members or to new investors. It can be complicated, whether you're a regular startup. It can be a little bit more complicated if you're a co-op. And so, so that I just wanted to kind of give that in terms of the Securities Law 101. I'll stop talking now so that we can move on to other pieces of this and the types of capital that you'd want to raise. And back to you, Adam.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Helen. And I think we've touched on the types of capital, whether it's bank debt, members, preferred shares. I think maybe question for you, Chris, in terms of on the lender side, when you're looking at a new startup, what are you looking at in terms of the capital that the startup is raising? And sort of how does that interact with what CFNE is going to do, right? Are you looking at, certain commitment from investors, commitment from members? What does that analysis look like? Because I have a feeling it's probably a little bit different than maybe some traditional banks would have in their lending decision.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to my previous comment, I'd say the most important piece is just how much time has been put in by the team. And sometimes clients will quantify sort of how many hours have everybody been putting in since the beginning. We sort of count that as sweat equity. And that's just something I would encourage for anybody, whether you're approaching a lender like us or not, is just like any startup, the bootstrapping side of startups is really the way to go, as far along as you possibly can. And that's a matter of, both donating your own time in kind, but, keep track of it, of what you're putting in. Certainly if you have equipment or things that are available to yourself or someone else that and you borrow that certainly helps. Often startups start out with leases rather than buying and purchasing. That all reduces the amount of capital that you need and gives you a bit of flexibility, because with a loan, you have to pay a fixed payment every month, no matter how things are going. And so we can certainly be flexible, especially in the first year or two, and provide interest only. But at first, I would, really encourage everyone to do, as much bootstrapping as they can without having to come to us. And then when they're ready to be, making sales and that sort of thing, is the right time to ask for loans.
Thanks, Chris. And
Yeah.
Greg, I think we've received a couple of questions, and I think I know I want to make sure we touch on this before we have to wrap up here. It's almost lunchtime, at least for us on the East Coast, so we don't want to run past noon for everyone. In terms of, we're talking about startups which have founders, right? And I know it's something that we've talked about, Greg, separately. In terms of valuing the contributions of founders, particularly non-monetary contributions, including some of what Chris just covered, and return on that effort and investment from the founders, what do you see in terms of how cooperatives can address that? And what are sort of some of the issues that founders have to deal with, right, as starting a cooperative, where as we mentioned, sort of the economics can be very different than your traditional corporation.
Yeah, this is one of the critiques of cooperatives, especially as we live in this era of Shark Tank and Silicon Valley and IPOs and all this. Is where's my big founder equity, right? Where's my big exit? I want to be Mark Zuckerberg. I don't want to run a co-op. So I think part of it is an expectation setting of saying, look, we're going to set the table for a broader range of people, not just yourself. But it doesn't mean that founders shouldn't get outsized shares. And we do think that, to Chris's point, founders are putting in early stage sweat equity. And so this comes up a lot with companies we talk to. And so you do have a few options. And this is a good thing to work with your attorney on, is you can do a promissory note for hours and time put in. So you have a way to get paid back and say, look, I've put in $60,000 of labor or $150,000 of labor or whatever it is. So some sort of value that's agreed upon by you and the company. You can do investor shares, which basically, if you're doing a preferred share class anyway, you can value your time through investor shares. So if you put in $60,000 of hours, you get $60,000 worth of investor shares. And then sometimes we're seeing people do a founders share class, but more and more often we're just trying to steer people to say, if you have investor shares, come of a way that you're make it so you're getting paid in the same way as your investors, I think is the easiest thing to value that early stage equity. And then I should add also, you can also just have a bonus agreement. So you can have an agreement with the board saying, if we hit certain milestones, are there bonuses that kick in for me? And that's another option.
Yeah, and Helen, you work obviously with a lot of startups. is that consistent with your experience sort of outside the cooperative world, or if there's any differences, what do you see?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, that often becomes a question. So when you have investors coming in for a, I'll call it a regular startup, so like not a benefit corporation or not a co-op, and a founder has put a lot of sweat equity into it, which is generally always the case. Sometimes there's a portion of that they will have evidenced by, as Greg noted, by a promissory note. So, or if they have put initial cash in, but they are not in a position to basically have that cash tied up indefinitely, they may have, you know, they call it a $60,000 promissory note that when you close on your first round of major financing, the founders would get paid back. Again, it can be a little bit of hit or miss because sometimes that the founders will, or sorry, the investors that come in will want to see that investment by the founder get rolled into the equity of the company and not actually get paid out of cash proceeds. But other times they're fine with it. And similar to what Greg was saying, where you would have a class of investor shares, or like call it Series Seed preferred stock, it could be that the value of that founder's contribution, to the extent you can attribute a cash value to that, would roll into the preferred equity that's offered in the initial offering. So a lot of these constructs that Greg just went through are very similar to what you would see in kind of a conventional setup.
Great. Thanks, Helen. And I think we only have a minute or two left. It looks like I think we've covered at least most of the questions I see. So let me turn it back to you, Greg, to sort of wrap up. And we had skipped over this point on an earlier slide, but you know, having worked with a lot of startups, if you could just provide sort of advice on, you know, what differentiates between the startups you see succeed and those that maybe aren't able to succeed long term, as a final takeaway here.
I'm on mute. I think the first thing is to take yourself off mute. I think the biggest thing is to get out of the building. You know, it's so easy in any new idea or any new business to sit here and say, I have this perfect plan on paper, right? And before you're ready to talk to investors, before you're ready to talk to Chris at Cooperative Fund in the Northeast, you got to actually go out and start building the business. And that means finding members, finding customers, and getting to critical mass. And I think it's really about validating those ideas, because after you launch, you're going to have to validate all those ideas anyway. And so we firmly believe, and this is what our Lean Co-op course is about, is you know, taking the risk out of it. So, you know, if you've got 3 things you're trying to figure out or 3 products you're trying to test, what is the smallest possible version that you can test before you take investor money, before you take loan money? Because showing that you've done that work is going to make it way more likely for you to actually get the resources you want.
Great, thanks, Greg. I think we're just at noon. You know, again, on behalf of everyone, I appreciate you joining us today. We put up our contact information. Certainly don't hesitate to reach out if there's any follow-up questions. We will send around an email afterwards, which will include some of the links that were shared here in the chat, as well as our contact information. So yeah, certainly there's a lot of resources in this space. We're happy to provide some of the ones we have, and we hope to hear from you. And I hope you're able to join us for some of our other webinars over the next few weeks. So thank you again, and hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.